All right, this is chapter 7, and this chapter is about the sort of first few years under the Constitution and how everything really works out uh, for this new sort of mode of government. So the first step to implementing the new government was to elect a president as well as a Congress. In the fall of 1788, the first election pitted the Federalists against the Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists won an overwhelming mandate. The electoral colleges met in February of 1789, with each elector choosing two candidates. Pretty much everyone nominated George Washington, and John Adams got the second most votes, and so he became vice president to Washington's president. Washington's election was not particularly surprising, since his reputation for honesty and integrity had greatly surpassed most of his peers, but this allowed him to basically calm America's fears about a strong executive, because we're still a little gun shy over the idea of an executive with as much power as the Constitution gives the executive. Congress began assembling in New York in March of 1789, and the first thing they did was establish 5 cabinet departments. And these were the Department of State, Treasury, War, the Attorney General, and the Postmaster General. Congress then was authorized to establish the federal courts below the Supreme Court, and to do so they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. This established a state federal district court as well that operated according to local procedure. They also struck a compromise between sort of national and states' rights advocates with the sort of formation of the judiciary under this act. The Constitution did offer some protection of citizens' individual rights, but it lacked a comprehensive Bill of Rights, and so one of the first sort of things that the Congress did upon assembling was to pass a comprehensive Bill of Rights. Several states had made their ratification conditional upon the addition of such a list, and so James Madison dutifully proposed the first 10 amendments. The First Amendment is designed to protect basic freedoms of expression. The second and third protect citizens from the most sinister embodiment of tyranny, which was a standing army. Amendments 4 through 8 limited the police power of the state, and 9 and 10 reserved to the states powers that were not already allocated to the federal government. The Bill of Rights imposed really no serious checks, though, on the nationalist objectives of the framers of the Constitution. Also, one of the first things to happen was that Alexander Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, issued 2 reports on public credit at the behest of Congress. And in these reports, he outlined a plan to strengthen the nation's credit. The federal government was funded, or rather chose to fund, through Hamilton's plan, the national debt by selling government bonds. Purchasers could get a combination of federal stocks and Western lands when they bought these bonds. He also proposed that the federal government pay off the $25 million in remaining state debt that was left over from the Revolution. He also urged the government to use money earned selling Western lands in order to pay off the $12 million that was owed to various European powers as quickly as possible. He recommended that Congress gather the interest owed on the rest by collecting customs duties on imports, and proposed an excise tax on whiskey. The plan was not to pay off the entire debt, but to rather keep paying the interest, which would mean that the government could hold up the national credit but incur the smallest cost possible. His recommendations were immediately controversial. No one doubted that the plan would enhance the nation's fiscal reputation, but a lot of people worried that those who were least deserving would be rewarded by the plan. The original owners of the government bonds during the Revolution were patriots of modest means, and most were forced to sell their bonds for a fraction of the initial value out of financial need immediately following the Revolution. Speculators then bought up the bonds, and so, as a result of Hamilton's plan, stood to gain, or to make huge gains at the expense of the original owners. Madison eventually emerged as the leading opponent of Hamilton's plan, which was something of a blow because he had been Hamilton's ally in the sort of framing of the Constitution and the fight to get it ratified. He also opposed assuming the states' war debts. Most of the states had managed to pay off a large chunk of their debt and did not really like being held responsible for the debts of other more irresponsible states. Hamilton only managed to save his proposal in Congress through the help of Thomas Jefferson. He agreed on a sort of bargain. Basically, the capital be moved to the Potomac River in exchange for Virginia supporting the plan. The debate confirmed a lot of Southern suspicions that Northern financial and commercial interests would benefit at Southerners' expense as a result of this plan. It did, however, completely reverse the nation's fiscal standing. It was intended to direct money to projects that would diversify the national economy through a federally chartered national bank. The proposal included raising $10 million through public stock offering, which shareholders could then profit handsomely off of. The bank itself then would cost nothing and be of great benefit to the nation. The government could use the bank to deposit tax revenues. They could make inexpensive loans to the government whenever taxes fell short, and issue paper notes that would relieve the scarcity of hard cash, as well as regulate business practices of state banks and provide credit to expand the economy. Most critics denounced the bank as a dangerous scheme to give small elite group a special power to influence the government. Shareholders could also very easily become tools of the unscrupulous politicians, and Madison yet again led the opposition to the bank, arguing that it was unconstitutional. Congress managed to approve the bank, however, by a very thin margin, and it landed soon on the desk of George Washington to make a decision. Washington asked advice from both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson feared that too much concentrated economic and political power would be dangerous to the nation, and also favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which didn't directly allow for the creation of such an institution. Hamilton, on the other hand, reasoned that the Constitution authorized Congress to enact all measures necessary and proper, and the only unconstitutional activities, therefore, were those that were expressly forbidden. And since the bank, or the creation of the bank, was not expressly forbidden, then it must be allowed. The president ultimately accepted Hamilton's argument and agreed to charter the bank for 20 years. And this signaled a deepening political divide within Washington's administration. Hamilton attempted to build support by appealing to economic self-interest, which was successful, but it was also very divisive. Opposition to his program was strongest where it offered very few benefits, which tended to be the more agrarian sections of the country, largely in the South and the West. Resentment against a program that mainly benefited Eastern moneymen and New England, who refused to pay its debt, united Southerners, Westerners, and the Mid-Atlantic citizens in a coalition which managed to challenge the Federalists. This coalition called for a return to true principles of republicanism, and so called themselves Republicans, and implied that Hamilton's schemes to centralize national government threatened liberty. Partisanship intensified as the election was approaching, but there was no real organized campaigning. Voters believed that parties were inherently corrupt and threatened liberty generally, and framers neither wanted nor planned for parties as part of national politics. George Washington appeared to remain above the party disputes and remained personally popular, and so he was reelected unanimously, and Adams was reelected by a slimmer margin. Hamilton's program sparked angry debate, however, and ignited civil insurrection in the form of the Whiskey Rebellion. This reflected some serious regional and class tensions that were developing in the new country. Hamilton's recommended excise tax on whiskey would help finance national debt, and, he argued, improve morals. Congress enacted the tax, but there were some that doubted Americans would tamely submit to these kind of limitations on their drinking. The validity of these doubts were proved when a crowd tarred and feathered an excise agent in Pittsburgh, and Westerners in Pennsylvania found it particularly burdensome. They usually distilled rye or corn into whiskey because it was far easier to transport across the mountains, as New Orleans was generally cut off to them by the Spanish. The excise was equal to about 25% of the retail value, and so pretty much wiped out all of the farmers' profit that they would have made from the whiskey. The law also stipulated that trials for evading the tax had to be conducted in federal courts, which meant that most of these western farmers would have to travel a distance of roughly 300 miles and bear the cost of that travel themselves. It also didn't help that the law was enforced unevenly. In July of 1794, roughly 100 western Pennsylvania farmers attacked a U.S. Marshal serving 60 delinquent taxpayers with summons. The crowd burned the chief revenue officer's house, and roving bands torched buildings, assaulted tax collectors, and generally harassed government supporters. Alexander Hamilton spoke out, condemning the rebellion as lawlessness, and Washington was even forced to muster the militia from Pennsylvania and the surrounding states in order to put down the rebellion. But before Washington and his troops could actually arrive, opposition to the law basically evaporated. The president withdrew then and left Hamilton to make arrests. This government response was important, though, because it served notice that citizens who resorted to violence or other extra legal means, like this rebellion or like Shays' rebellion previously, would feel the full force of the strengthened federal government under the new Constitution. And it definitely put a damper on the idea of rebellion as a means of political action under the new government. By 1793, debates about foreign affairs emerged as the primary source of friction in American public life. European and Atlantic powers remained in a state of war for most of the next 22 years, and Americans hoped to stay out of the conflict, but their interests and values usually led them to be partial to someone's side, whether it be Britain, France, Spain, or some other. The differences over foreign policy fused with differences over domestic affairs in America. Spain enjoyed a brief revival of its North American fortunes in the late 18th century and sought to force the Comanche to end their raids in Spanish colonies and their native allies in the sort of northern colonies, New Mexico and Texas. This succeeded up to a point, but efforts in those areas, New Mexico and Texas, were part of a larger effort to counter rivals for North American territory and influence. The first challenge arose in the Pacific when Russian traders entered into the territory of Alaska and set up a colony there. Spain expanded northward and established California, and efforts to encourage large-scale immigration, however, failed in Spain. The coastal native at first welcomed the Spanish as support against their inland adversaries, but that very quickly changed. Missionaries sought to convert them to Catholicism and imposed very harsh disciplinary measures on the native tribes. The colonists also spread epidemic as well as venereal diseases, and the population declined rapidly. Although the Treaty of Paris granted sovereignty to the U.S. of all territory between the Mississippi River and the mountains, Spain, as well as the British and numerous tribes, resisted the U.S. taking control of that area. The nation was really in no position to dictate the developments, and so George Washington pursued a course of diplomacy. The prospects for peace improved, however, when Spain agreed to open the port of New Orleans to U.S. commerce quite unexpectedly in 1789. The Spanish officials bribed well-known political figures in Tennessee and Kentucky. One congressman from western Pennsylvania was scheming with the British, and others in other states were sort of wishy-washy as far as their loyalties went. Washington attempted to weaken Spanish influence by neutralizing their ally, the Creek, and in 1790, a Creek leader signed the Treaty of New York, which permitted American settlers to remain on the lands in the Georgia Piedmont, which they had formerly been fighting over. a rather harsher policy was taken toward the Native Americans who resisted settlers in the Ohio Valley. The Shawnee had success against the American forces, and having twice humiliated the soldiers, Washington's Western policy was now in something of a shambles. Matters only worsened when the Spanish persuaded the Creek to renounce the Treaty of New York, and a lot of Americans became convinced that the combined strength of Britain, Spain, and the native tribes would only be countered by a closer alliance with France. France was, of course, having its own troubles because the French Revolution officially kicked off in July of 1789. This revolution was inspired by the American Revolution, and the Americans were initially sympathetic to it. It took something of a radical turn, however, in the early 1790s, and Americans were bitterly divided in their attitudes toward this new phase of the Revolution and how the U.S. should respond to it. Republicans generally supported the Revolution as an assault on monarchy and tyranny, but the Federalists denounced it as mobocracy, especially once it became much more radical. White Southern slaveholders were also among Francis Pierce's supporters. The Revolution itself also spread to France's Caribbean colonies, especially the colony of Saint-Dominique. This saw the division of whites in the colony and inspired enslaved blacks to demand liberty and equality. French planters eventually were forced out and fled to the U.S., and once they arrived, recounted how British invaders were supporting the black revolutionaries. And this ignited a certain amount of fear, as you might understand, in the Southern planters who heard the stories, because they feared that the same thing would happen in their own states. Northerners were generally more repelled by political, social, and religious upheaval in revolutionary France. The Protestants detested them for worshiping reason over God. The Federalists condemned the leaders as radicals who would incite the poor against the rich. And the reactions also diverged for economic reasons. Merchant shippers and sailors feared that an alliance with France would provoke British retaliation against American commerce, and so were a little wary of creating a closer alliance. Southern elites, however, saw the reliance on British commerce as a menace to national self-determination, and so wanted a closer relationship with France. The support for France in the West and South grew when France went to war against Britain and Spain. France actively tried to embroil the U.S. in its conflicts after the declarations of war, and they sent one Edmond Genet to mobilize Republican sentiment in the support of France. He enlisted American mercenaries to attack shipping, British and Spanish shipping, and to strengthen the French-American alliance. George Washington responded to this with a proclamation of American neutrality. However, despite this proclamation, Genet continued to recruit volunteers for his American Foreign Legion and directed them to seize Spanish garrisons. He was even threatening to urge Americans to defy their own government. The administration responded by closing U.S. harbors to Genet's buccaneers and demanding that Genet be recalled. But this had already sparked an Anglo-American crisis. English ministers decided that only a massive show of force would deter American support for France, and so they ordered their navy to confiscate foreign ships trading in the French West Indies. Of course, they delayed these instructions so that the U.S. ships would already have left U.S. ports, and so managed to capture about 250 U.S. ships as a result. They began impressing U.S. sailors as well. They mainly took British sailors who had left and gone to work for the U.S. Merchant Marine, but they also took U.S. citizens, and this proved to be a long-standing controversy. Britain, Spain, and the various native tribes continued to challenge U.S. control over Western territory. The Canadian royal government delivered an inflammatory speech which denied any U.S. claims north of the Ohio River and urged the destruction of American settlements in the Northwest Territory. British troops were also building an 8th garrison in the territory itself, and the Spanish were encroaching on the territory in order to build a fort for themselves. Hoping to halt this sort of drift towards war, Washington launched 3 separate initiatives. The first of these was to negotiate a treaty with the Shawnee. They initially scoffed at the offer, and so General Wayne was sent to launch an attack and managed to rout about 400 Shawnee at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers. They tried to run to a British fort, but the British shut the gates and wouldn't let them in, and so they were forced to succumb to the Americans. Native morale plummeted after that loss and the British betrayal that went with it. General Wayne then managed to compel the Shawnee and other tribes to sign the Treaty of Grenville, which opened most of the Ohio Territory to settlement. The victory at Fallen Timbers helped John Jay to win a British promise to withdraw troops from American soil in what became known as Jay's Treaty. Very few Americans, however, saw the treaty as preserving peace with honor, as this left Britain free to violate American neutrality and restrict trade with France, and it failed to end impressment, so Jay didn't receive very much acclaim for his successes. The South was especially sore because it didn't get any compensation for slaves that were taken during the Revolution. Despite its unpopularity, however, it did manage to prevent war with Britain and ended their occupation of the Ohio Territory. The third initiative was the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and that was negotiated with Spain. This won Westerners the right to unrestricted duty-free access to the port of New Orleans in order to more easily market their goods. They also agreed to recognize the 31st parallel as the border between the U.S. and Florida, and also agreed to dismantle any fortifications it had on U.S. soil. Spain also agreed in this treaty to discourage any raids by their native allies, and so overall, it was something of a win for Washington. So all of these conflicting attitudes about events in France, federal power, democracy, all of these things accelerated the polarization of American politics, and Federalists were terrified with things like the French Revolution going on. Federalists really feared the thought of guillotines and mob rule coming over to America in the same way that they were taking over France. By the mid-1790s, the Federalists' worst fears about democracy seemed to have been confirmed in France. The people, they believed, were undependable and vulnerable to these sort of rabble-rousers, such as Guéret, who had come over trying to drum up support for the French. They argued that in the same way that this was in colonial times, ordinary voters should not be presented with choices over policy, but rather should simply vote on the basis of personal merits of elite candidates. Elected officials would then rule in the people's name, but be independent of direct popular influence. The Republicans, on the other hand, insisted that liberty would be safe only if power were widely diffused among the white male property owners of the nation. This, at first glance, may seem contradictory for Southern slave owners to support a radical ideology like republicanism with its emphasis on liberty and equality. And although a few Southern Republicans advocated abolishing slavery gradually, most are very far more concerned that slave violence, like what we see in Saint-Dominique, would spread to the American slave states in the South. And although terms like freedom and equality and liberty were expressed in rather sort of universal terms, they were largely intended for white men only. Political ambition drove men like Jefferson and Madison to rouse ordinary voters' concerns about civic affairs. Federalists could be held accountable to the public, then they might think twice before enacting measures that would be opposed by the majority, or at least that was the idea. Each side, both the Federalists and the Republicans, tended to portray themselves as the guardian of Republican virtue and would attack the other side as an illegitimate faction. Opponents of Federalist policies began organizing democratic societies, and these were formed largely on seaboard cities and also in the rural South and West. And their members tended to include people like planters, small farmers, merchants, artisans, distillers, sailors, although conspicuously absent were anyone connected to big business, the clergy, the poor, anyone who was not white, and women, all suspiciously left out. In 1794, party development began to reach a very decisive stage after Washington openly identified himself with the Federalist faction rather than the Republicans. Republicans then attacked Federalist pro-British leanings and a lot of local elections and managed to win a slight majority in the House of Representatives. And this signaled the Republicans' transformation from merely a coalition of office holders and local societies to a more broad-based political party, which was capable of coordinating local campaigns throughout the nation. Both parties used the press in order to mold and shape public opinion. Newspapers for both sides didn't hesitate to engage in various amounts of fear-mongering and character assassination. But despite all of their extreme rhetoric, newspaper warfare stimulated a lot of citizens to become politically active. Washington began to grow impatient with the nation's growing polarization into openly hostile parties, and he deeply resented Republicans' charges that he had secretly supported Federalist plots to establish a monarchy, plots which were never proven to have existed in the first place. He was rather unhappy towards the end of his second term. He was surrounded by mediocre advisors, with Hamilton having returned to private life. And so he decided in the spring of 1796 to retire after serving 2 terms as president, setting something of a precedent that presidents would only serve 2 terms until Franklin Roosevelt was elected for an unprecedented 3rd and 4th term, which ultimately resulted in the constitutional amendment, which would limit presidents to 2 terms. Upon his decision to retire, he asked his old friend Alexander Hamilton to write his farewell address for him. And at the heart of this message was a very vigorous condemnation of political parties. Partisan alignments, he argued, endangered the Republic's survival, especially if they were to become entangled in disputes over foreign policy. And this hearkening directly back to all of the problems that resulted as the French Revolution was taking off and was becoming a big part of American party politics. Washington also warned that the country's safety would depend on citizens avoiding excessive partiality for one nation and excessive dislike of another. So those foreign entanglements. Washington and Hamilton had skillfully turned Republicanism's fear of corruption against their Republican critics. They had also managed to evoke a vision of an America which was virtuously isolated from foreign intrigue and power politics, and which would remain a very potent inspiration for a long time afterward. With the election of 1796 approaching, the Republicans cultivated a very large and loyal body of voters. Their efforts to marshal popular support marked the first time since the Constitution was ratified that political elites had effectively managed to mobilize non-elites to participate in the political process. Immigrants became prime targets for Republican recruiters. And in 1796, the presidential candidates were the Federalist Vice President, John Adams, and the Republicans' nomination, Thomas Jefferson. The Republicans expected to win as many Southern electoral votes and congressional seats as the Federalists counted on in New England, New Jersey, and South Carolina. The crucial swing states would be Pennsylvania and New York, where the Republicans fought their hardest in order to win the large immigrant vote, with their pro-French, anti-British rhetoric. In the end, all of their efforts weren't enough, as Pennsylvania went to the Republicans, but New York didn't. And so this left the country in a bit of a conundrum. Jefferson managed to lose the presidency by just 3 electoral votes, and as the second highest vote getter in the Electoral College, he became vice president. And so this left the country with a Federalist president and a Republican vice president. The Federalists also managed to narrowly regain control of the House and maintained a very firm grip on the Senate. The new president, John Adams, was much more comfortable with ideas than with people. He inspired quite a lot of admiration, but not a lot of personal loyalty. His stubborn personality and general disdain for ordinary people left a lot of politicians a little wary of him and doubtful of his ability to effectively govern. And in the end, he was unable to unify either his party or the country behind him and his leadership. So the French had already recognized that Jay's Treaty was a Federalist-sponsored attempt to assist Britain in the war against France. On learning of Jefferson's defeat, the French began seizing American ships that were carrying goods to British ports, and within a year had managed to plunder more than 300 American vessels. Hoping to avoid war, Adams sent a peace commission to Paris, but the French foreign minister, named Charles de Talleyrand, refused to meet with the delegation, and instead, promising through 3 unnamed agents, X, Y, and Z, that the talks could begin only after he received $250,000, and France obtained a loan of $12 million. This was accidentally on purpose leaked to the American public, who were outraged at this bare-faced demand for a bribe from the American delegation, and it became known as the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair completely discredited the Republicans' foreign policy views, but the party's leaders compounded the damage by refusing to condemn the French aggression on the seas and also opposing for Adams' call for military preparations. Adams responded to the XYZ affair by joining Britain in a trade agreement with François Dominique Toussaint Louverture, a charismatic former slave who led what was now an independence movement and controlled most of Saint-Dominique. The administration and Congress also armed 54 ships to protect American commerce on the Caribbean. By 1799, the French were no longer a serious naval threat, and American commerce was flourishing. The Federalist-dominated Congress also quadrupled the size of the regular army. Yet the risk of a land war with France was actually pretty minimal. In reality, the Federalists wanted a military force ready in the event of a civil war because things were heating up with the Republicans more than anything. The most heated of controversies in the late 1790s arose from a Federalist insistence that the threat of war with France required strict laws to protect national security, and the strict laws that were passed became known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The least controversial of these laws were the Alien Enemies Act, which authorized the jailing or deporting of those who were deemed spies or saboteurs, because this only operated in the case that Congress declared war. The second act was the Alien Friends Act, and it was a temporary statute that authorized the president to expel any foreign residents whose activities he considered to be dangerous. The law didn't require any proof of guilt, on the assumption that a spy would hide or destroy any evidence of their crime anyway, and Republicans responded by maintaining that the law's real purpose was to deport immigrants who were critical of Federalist policies. Remember, the Republicans had been courting the immigrant vote in the last election, 1796. Republicans also denounced the third law, which was the Naturalization Act. This increased the residency requirement for U.S. citizenship from 5 years to a whopping 14 years. again, the charge was that the purpose was to reduce the Irish vote, essentially. Again, immigrant votes, which again the Republicans were courting. The Sedition Act was the only one of these measures that was enforceable against already existing U.S. citizens, and it was probably the most controversial of all of these. The act defined criminal activity so broadly that it blurred any distinction between sedition and legitimate political discussion. For example, it prohibited an individual or group from opposing any measure or measures of the United States, wording which could be interpreted to ban any kind of criticism of the party in power, which again would severely limit political discourse and make it very difficult for democracy to exist. The Sedition Act also interfered pretty blatantly with free speech. Ingeniously, the Federalists, however, wrote the law to expire in 1801, which meant that in the case that they lost the election of 1800, the law couldn't be used against them when they were no longer the party in power, which pretty much made it fairly obvious that this was a politically motivated law rather than one that was actually intended to address actual dangers. A principal target of the Federalist repression was the opposition press. Republican newspapers were charged with sedition just as the election campaign of 1800 was getting underway. Federalist leaders never really intended to fill the jails with Republican martyrs. However, they did hope to use a few highly visible prosecutions to silence the majority of Republican journalists and candidates during the election of 1800, and it pretty much didn't work. The shocked Republicans concluded that because the Federalists controlled all three branches of government, neither the Bill of Rights nor the system of checks and balances reliably protected individual liberties. And so they began to advance the doctrine of states' rights as a means of restraining the federal government. And this is basically the beginning of a very long-standing argument that goes on even into today's politics. Madison and Jefferson anonymously wrote manifestos on states' rights, and these were known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution, where he declared that state legislatures had never surrendered their right to judge the constitutionality of federal actions, and that they retained an authority called interposition, which would enable them to protect the liberties of their citizens. Jefferson, who penned the Kentucky Resolution, went even further by declaring that ultimate sovereignty still resided with the states, and that empowered them to nullify federal laws, to which they objected. The intention of both of these resolutions was to invalidate any federal law in a state which had deemed the law unconstitutional. And although the resolutions were intended as nonviolent protests, they did challenge the jurisdiction of federal courts. No state, however, actively endorsed the resolutions, and 10 at least expressly disapproved them. The passage of them, however, demonstrated the great potential for disunion even as early as the 1790s. And this potential for disunion only simmers and boils right under the surface all the way up till we do actually have a civil war. It just took us a while to get round to it. The nation's leaders increasingly acted as if a crisis was imminent. Vice President Jefferson hinted that events might push the southern states into secession, while President Adams hid guns in his home. After passing through Richmond and learning that state officials were purchasing thousands of muskets for the militia, an alarmed Supreme Court justice wrote that the General Assembly of Virginia were pursuing steps which would lead directly to civil war. And so a very tense atmosphere hung over the Republic as the election of 1800 drew near, and there was a very real possibility that American democracy was just going to fall apart as a result of the conflict surrounding this election. In the election itself, the two parties again rallied around the Federalist John Adams and the Republican Thomas Jefferson. The leadership of moderates in both parties helped to ensure that the nation survived the election of 1800 without falling into a civil war. So in fact, the most remarkable thing about the election of 1800 is that it didn't result in anything. The whole election went off without a hitch. and the other party manages to take over the government. In 1799, Adams suddenly learned that France wanted peace. The Federalist leadership had already concluded that nothing but an open war can save us. And despite that conclusion, Adams still recommended a special diplomatic mission be sent to France in order to ensure peace, going against his party's wishes. One Federalist senator, on hearing this news, expressed surprise and indignation at sort of Adams' apparent turncoat action. Adams did manage to obtain Senate approval for his envoys only by threatening to resign the presidency, thus making Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, the president by sort of de facto. The high Federalists were outraged and attempted to dump Adams, but their ill-considered maneuver rallied most of the New Englanders around the rather stubborn president. And so the Federalists were starting to fracture internally as a party. Adams' envoys did not achieve a settlement with France until 1800, but his pursuit of peace with France prevented the Federalists from exploiting charges of Republican sympathy for the enemy. Without the immediate threat of war, voters also grew resentful that in only 2 years, taxes had risen, a massive standing army had been raised, and as the danger of war receded, voters also gave the Federalists less credit for standing up to France and more blame for adding roughly $10 million to the national debt. The Republicans, with this going on, began to redouble their efforts in order to elect Jefferson. The Republicans' mobilization of voters, popular interest in politics began to rise sharply. Adams managed to lose the presidency by just 8 electoral votes, but his loss did not ensure Jefferson's election because there was a problem written into the presidential election procedures as outlined in the Constitution. It says in the Constitution that the person receiving the most votes would be president, and the person receiving the second most votes would be vice president, and each elector would get to name 2 people. All of the Republican electors voted for both Jefferson and their own choice for vice president, which was New York's Aaron Burr, which meant also that Jefferson and Aaron Burr both received 73 votes. There was no clear victor. In order to resolve a deadlocked electoral college, the Constitution dictated that the election would be thrown to the House of Representatives, who would then vote for either one or the other. Aware that Republican voters and electors wanted Jefferson to be president, Burr began to look around for Federalist support inside the House. Alexander Hamilton is a member of the House of Representatives, and he was also a very bitter rival of Burr's within their home state of New York. And he declared his preference for Jefferson as basically the lesser of 2 evils. And because he was still a major figure in the Federalist Party, the rest of the Federalists tended to follow him, and this basically gave Jefferson the presidency and also put a massive bee in Burr's bonnet for both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. For centuries, most economic production in Europe, as well as their colonial offshoots, took place inside the household. At the core of each household was a sort of patriarchal nuclear family. And a lot of American households, however, included additional people, relatives, boarders, apprentices, journeymen, and so on and so forth. And although households varied greatly in the late 18th century, most were on small farms and consisted only of an owner and his family. While husbands and older sons would work in the fields away from the house, wives and daughters and young sons would maintain the barns and the gardens and all those things near the house. Most farm families produced food and other products largely for their own consumption and added small surpluses for bartering with their neighbors or with local merchants. But after the American Revolution, households in the most densely populated regions of the Northeast began to change. Relatively prosperous farm families increased their surplus production in order to meet the growing demands of urban customers for things like produce and meat and dairy products. Poorer farm families, especially New England, found less lucrative ways to produce for the growing commercial markets in the country. While many young men and young couples would move west, and other young men would go to sea, unmarried daughters more frequently remained at home, where they would help to satisfy a growing demand for things like ready-made clothing. After the Revolution, enterprising merchants began catering to urban customers, as well as Southern slave owners, to seek cloth, who sought to clothe their slaves as cheaply as possible. I got mixed up. There were other enterprises, however, which were also emerging at this time, which employed men as well as women in order to satisfy the needs that self-contained households could never have met on their own. Behind all these new industries was an ambitious and aggressive class of businessmen, most of whom began as merchants and were now investing their profits in factories, ships, government bonds, and banks. These entrepreneurs stimulated a flurry of innovative business ventures that pointed towards the future of the country. The first private banks were founded in the 1780s. And you also have, created by Philadelphia merchants, the Pennsylvania Society for the Encouragement of Manufactures and the Useful Arts in 1787. This organization promoted the immigration of English artisans familiar with the latest industrial technology. And in 1791, similar societies were formed in other states. A society for the encouragement of useful manufacturers, which attempted to demonstrate the potential of large-scale industry enterprises by building a factory town at Paterson in New Jersey. The same year, New York merchants and insurance underwriters organized America's first formal association of trading government bonds, which was the precursor to the New York Stock Exchange. For a lot of Americans, the choice between manufacturing and farming was a moral as well as an economic decision. Hamilton admired efficiently run factories in which few managers supervised large numbers of workers. Manufacturing would provide employment opportunities, promote immigration, and expand the applications of technology. And it would also offer a greater scope for the talents and dispositions of men, afford a more ample and various field of enterprise, and create a more certain and steady demand for the surplus produce of the soil. Jefferson, on the other hand, idealized the traditional white land-owning family farmers as the bulwarks of Republican liberty and virtue, writing that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people. For Hamilton, capital, technology, and managerial discipline were the surest roads to national order and wealth, while Jefferson put more trust in the white male citizens and envisioned land as the key to prosperity and liberty for all. Alongside all of this growing economic precursor to industrialism atmosphere, you also have a growing importance of women's economic roles, and growing discussion over republicanism started to raise questions about women's rights and equality. Yet women didn't gain political rights, with the exception of New Jersey. Social change and Republican ideology together fostered several formidable challenges to traditional attitudes towards women's rights. American Republicans increasingly recognized the right of a woman to choose her husband, which was a striking departure from the continued practice among some elites where fathers would approve or even arrange a marriage for their daughters. Outside of elite circles, such independence was even more apparent, especially in places like the Northeast. Daughters increasingly would intentionally get pregnant by their preferred partners, thus forcing their fathers to consent to marrying in order to avoid a public scandal. White women were also having fewer children overall than their mothers or grandmothers had previously. Such statistics testify to the declining farm sizes as well as urbanization that characterized the period, both of which were incentives for having fewer children. They also indicate, however, that some women were finding relief from the near constant state of pregnancy and nursing that had consumed the earlier generations. As white women's roles began to expand, so too did Republican notions of male-female relations. "I object to the word obey in the marriage service," wrote one female author who called herself matrimonial Republican. "The obedience between man and wife is or ought to be mutual," she continued. A few women also began to challenge the sexual double standard that allowed men to indulge in extramarital affairs while their female partners, whether they were single or married, were often condemned. One author, calling herself Daphne, pointed out how a woman whose illicit fare was exposed and forever deprived of all the recess of his unmanly arts and to pass unpunished by even a frown. Daphne also called on her sister Americans to stand by and support the dignity of our own sex by publicly condemning seducers rather than their victims, thus turning the tables onto the men and away from the women. Gradually, the subordination of women, which most whites had always taken for granted, became a subject of debate, with one poet, Judith Sargent Murray, contending that the genders had equal intellectual ability and deserved equal education. Like many of her contemporaries, Murray also supported the idea of Republican motherhood. Advocates for this idea emphasized the importance of educating white women in the values of liberty and independence in order to strengthen the virtue of the nation. Because it was the Republican duty of mothers to inculcate these values in their sons, who were the nation's future leaders, as well as in their daughters, who were the nation's future passers on of Republican virtue. Before the 1780s, only a few women had acquired an advanced education through private tutors, but thereafter, urban elites broadened these opportunities by founding numerous private schools or academies specifically for girls. Although the new struggle for female political equality would not begin until the next century, assertions that women were intellectually and morally men's peers and that Republican mothers played a vital public role provoked additional calls for equality beyond those voiced by Abigail Adams and a few other women during the Revolution itself. Neither any of these writers nor anyone else at the time challenged prohibitions against married women's ownership of property, nor did these ideas apply to anyone other than white women. So it was still a very limited scope for this particular idea. Native Americans occupied probably the most tenuous position in all of American society. By 1800, Native Americans east of the Mississippi had suffered severe losses of population, territory, and political and cultural self-determination. The Native Americans lost more land than the area inhabited by whites in 1775, with squatters, liquor dealers, and criminals trespassing on lands and often defrauding, stealing, or inflicting violence on the natives that they encountered, as well as provoking them to retaliate, which then begat a government retaliation against them, which only served to worsen their condition. While employing military force against Native Americans who resisted the U.S. authority, Washington and his Secretary of War recognized that American citizens' actions often contributed to the resentment held by the Native Americans. And accordingly, they pursued a policy similar to Britain's under the Proclamation of 1763, where the federal government sought to regulate relations between Indians and non-Indians. And to further this, Congress enacted a new policy, which became essentially defined in a series of acts known as the Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts. In order to halt fraudulent land cessions, the acts prohibited any transfers of tribal lands to outsiders, except as authorized by formal treaties. Other provisions regulated the conduct of non-Indians on lands still under tribal control. To regulate intercultural trade and reduce abuses, they required traders to be licensed. It also defined murder and other abuses committed by non-Indians against Indians on tribal land as federal offenses, and authorized the federal government to establish programs that would promote civilization among the Native Americans as a replacement for traditional culture, which by civilization, it was meant Anglo-American culture, particularly that bit about private property ownership and a strictly agricultural way of life. By abandoning communal land ownership and seasonal migrations for hunting and gathering and fishing, they argued that the Native Americans would no longer need most of the land they were trying to protect, which would then make it available for whites. And all of this sounds well and good, but the law was largely unenforced. The first years of the Republic, marked a high tide for African Americans. Revolutionary successes in bettering their lot were at a high point, but were waning quickly as we move further on. Black Americans and even a lot of white Americans recognized that the ideals of liberty and equality were inconsistent with the practice of slavery, and by 1790, roughly 8% of all African Americans had been freed from slavery. 10 years later, that percentage jumped to 11%. Various state measures, meanwhile, attempted to improve the conditions of those who remained in slavery, and by 1794, most states had outlawed the Atlantic slave trade. Some hesitant measures were made to ensure Black Americans' legal equality, but also appeared in the 1780s and early 1790s. By 1796, all but 3 of the 16 states either permitted free blacks to vote or did not specifically exclude them. By then, a counter-trend was beginning to reverse a lot of the Revolutionary era advances. But before the 1790s ended, free blacks faced new obstacles to equality, while abolitionist sentiment started to ebb among whites, and slavery became much more entrenched. So it was a very narrow window where improvement was obvious. Federal law pretty much led the way in restricting the rights of free blacks and other non-white citizens. In 1790, Congress passed the first Naturalization Act, which limited eligibility for U.S. citizenship to free white aliens. The federal militia law in 1792 required whites to enroll in local units but allowed states to exclude free blacks. The Navy and Marine Corps also forbade any non-white enlistments in 1798. And Delaware stripped free property-owning black males of the vote in 1792. The number of settings in which these individuals were treated as equals began to drop very sharply in this period as well. Federal legislation also reinforced slavery itself and racism with the passage of a fugitive slave law in 1793. This law required judges to award possession of an escaped slave upon any formal request by a master or his representative. Accused runaways not only were denied a trial by jury, but they were also sometimes refused permission to present any evidence of their freedom. Slaves' legal status as property disqualified them from claiming these constitutional privileges, but the fugitive slave law also denied free blacks the legal protections of the Bill of Rights. Congress nevertheless passed the measure without any serious opposition in the 1790s. Despite these growing restrictions, some free blacks managed to become landowners or skilled artisans, and a few even gained recognition among the white population. In resisting limitations on their freedom and opportunities, free black Americans in the North turned to one another for support. Self-help among these communities flowed especially through religious channels, with the Free African Society of Philadelphia being an excellent example of a community organization whose members would pool their scarce resources to assist one another and other black Americans in need. In 1793, Philadelphia experienced a yellow fever epidemic, in which about 4,000 residents died. As the most affluent whites fled, black community leaders organized a relief effort in which black Americans, at great personal risk, tended to the sick and buried the dead of both races. But their only reward was a vicious publicity campaign wrongly accusing them of profiting at whites' expense. Enslaved African Americans also banded together in the quest for freedom, especially in Virginia, where both blacks and whites very closely followed the news of developments in Saint Dominique. While slave owners feared retaliation by enslaved Africans, the latter drew inspiration from the uprising. In August of 1800, both sides' expectations seemed to have been realized when the slave insurrection, known popularly as Gabriel's Rebellion, broke out near Richmond. A slave named Gabriel and his followers calculated that the split among whites afforded blacks an opportunity to gain their freedom. And having secretly assembled weapons, he led a march on Richmond by more than 1,000 slaves. But the plot had been leaked on the night before it took place, and the march was broken up relatively quickly and easily. Authorities managed to obtain confessions from some participants and rounded up the rest, executing roughly 35 of them, including the leader, Gabriel. Gabriel's rebellion only managed to confirm anxieties that white citizens had following Haiti's revolution and the fear that it could replay itself on American soil. While concluding that their slaves required brutal repression, a lot of planners began to question slavery's economic necessity, especially with the decline of tobacco production in the Chesapeake. It would be a technological development that ultimately rescued the institution of slavery itself. During the 1790s, demand in the British textile industry began to stimulate the cultivation of cotton, but it wouldn't become a viable cash crop until 1793 when a New Englander by the name of Eli Whitney invented a cotton gin, which successfully separated the fibers of short staple cotton from the seed. Whitney's invention removed a major obstacle to the westward spread of cotton cultivation, and it also gave a new lease on life to the plantation as well as plantation slavery, and undermined the doubts that any might have had concerning the economic viability of the institution itself. By 1800, free blacks had suffered noticeable erosion of their post-revolutionary gains, and Southern slaves were further from freedom than they had been even a decade earlier.